I think for us, it's really interesting to watch this through, a quasi EM prism, because in EM, where the depth of capital and again, these levers that can be pulled behind the curtain are far more restrictive. We have already seen this sort of play out in different levels, but I think, yeah, clearly the way this inflation is playing out, and I think, subsequently why the Fed is so aggressively trying to jawbone rates higher at this point is because they absolutely have to quell animal spirits, because animal spirits and inflation expectations are just as important for them. In the past, we've always talked about the signaling as the Fed would try to achieve their goals without having to actually implement the policy. I think, an economist I know had mentioned that the Fed had spent the last 10 years always conjuring up excuses for retaining easier policy than they should have. And in the past 6 months, it's completely reversed, where they're now coming up with sort of excuses. Even when the market is signaling, hey, policy error potentially ahead, Powell has to back off, because to your point, they're trying to address this sort of unequal impact, which will be very difficult. I mean, Miami is probably not a fair example, but it's arguably they've been like the largest sort of beneficiary of whatever paper, wealth accumulation, crypto wealth, grift, whatever you want to call it. And even in January, in the most recent housing prices there were up 28% year over year, and rents are up 56% in 2 years. And that's going to be an issue now because the Fed's hiking rates, again, they haven't addressed the housing supply issue. So we've discussed this. First-time buyers, their monthly payment has just doubled in a couple of months, which is precluding them from entering the market as maybe they had anticipated just 3 or 4 months ago, which means they're required to continue to rent, or I guess worst case, live with your parents. But the rental rates are soaring as well because it's the same issue. And I mean, I can't validate this, but I've seen it in a couple of different journals. I've read that financial institutions or entities are now controlling about 25% of our housing or real estate stock in this country. So again, this is like 40 years buildup where, yeah, it does impact them. And I think obviously, fuel prices and food prices and all these other associated things impact them unless we see real wages increase to a point, or unless we see, I think Musk or whoever it was has predicted this in the past as well, but universal basic income, which comes in. I love capitalism. It's great. I do think, unfortunately, it's been a bit hijacked, and I kind of go back to the lobbyist or the lawyer, figures earlier, which has sort of created different loopholes, and that's problematic. But we'll just have to kind of see how it plays out. But I think addressing that will require, there's gonna be a more populist tilt to however this is going to be addressed. And sorry, what I meant to say too was, unfortunately, the private sector, not unfortunately, but the private sector is just always much more nimble and arguably much smarter than the public sector. And I think you could speak to tech much more than I could, but I think even looking at in the past 40 years, areas where the government sort of intervened in theory to try and help the lower incomes, primarily education and healthcare, with subsidies and these plans. And what's happened is that those are probably the two most explosive. I mean, those areas have experienced inflation for decades. And I think now just what was happening there is kind of matriculating across different sectors. So I don't know if I have a great answer, but I agree with you. And I guess the answer is that as the voting demographic transitions, I think the votes are more, we're seeing this already a bit with AOCs and Elizabeth Warrens, and those people are becoming, I think, increasingly mainstream. And so I would anticipate in the next 10 to 20 years that there's going to be a large part of the population that, unless things get recalibrated, are going to vote for a more socialist leaning candidate. That would just be and that's how our democracy typically works. Like, right, if all these data, I think the statistics are almost irrefutable, but if 70, 80, 90% of your voting population essentially is losing on a relative basis, they should theoretically vote for change.
Mm-hmm.